Florian, Heinrich about depth perception in augmented reality. In case we are already running late, please.
Thank you for the kind introduction. As already said, my talk is all about depth perception in projective or projection-based augmented reality. And what we did was to do an evaluation study of some more advanced visualization techniques. So, why did we do this at all? So, I'm coming from a medical background, but I'm a computer scientist, but we're working on the medical domain. So, our aim in using augmented reality is to just convey all the needed information more intuitively. So, this starts from just visualizing some organs or deep-seated tumors or stuff like that. So the problems with these AR visualizations that we want to use in this case is that they are often affected by some perceptual issues, which is well known, and among these perceptual issues, the correct perception of distances and depth is the most common one. So when you're looking at some critical domains, like the medical one, this is especially a problem which we have to address. Previous research in this field followed different directions. On the one hand, some existing techniques were analyzed and compared just to find out, well, we do know we have these perceptual issues, but among these techniques that we already know, what technique would you should use best? One example is a study using video see-through AR by VRST et al. Different approach goes into the direction that they say, okay, these techniques that are already existing aren't sufficient enough, we have to do something more, and there have been developed a couple of techniques, and the virtual window technique is just one example of those. So when we're looking at the literature in these approaches on solving these perceptual AR issues, what comes clear is that mostly all of these were focused on see-through AR modalities, like video see-through monitors, tablet PCs, or stuff like that. But that's not every solution we could use in doing AR. Especially we are focusing on projection-based systems, and these may be preferable in some applications, like for our medical domain, we have less or even no sterility problems because the projectors can just be mounted on top of the operation room. In this way, we also have less spatial problems, especially compared to monitors, which would be in the way. And we have lower drawbacks to the users. One example would be when you're looking at the HoloLens. I think everyone who's worn the HoloLens once for a longer time knows that it gets really uncomfortable. So these are some pros of using projection systems, but there's also some big buts which we have to address too. So we have some different visualizing properties of these projection systems overall. We have a very low contrast and we have lower resolution sometimes. This all comes down to problems with shadows and external lighting conditions, because projectors are just projecting light, different colored light, onto our surfaces, and when we have different light sources, this all affects everything that we see. There's also the problem that we can't project dark colors, we can just project light colors. So this questions or raises the question whether all these previous results that were received can be transferred to this displaying modality after all. So we want to use this projection system, we know there are perceptual issues, but we can't be sure if we can use all this information from previous research. So we decided on conducting our own study to fill this gap. So what we did was, at first, we set up our multi-projector camera system. We had 2 stereoscopic projectors in this system. In these pictures you see more projectors, but they weren't used in this setup. We have these 2 stereoscopic ones, one at the left, one at the right, and both had some active shutter 3D system. And to make use of some kinematic depth cues, we used head tracking, and we tracked the user's head position by putting an HTC Vive tracker on top of a helmet which was worn by the user, which may seem impractical when we are looking at we want to use it in the end in the medical domain, but this is a problem of a different day. So for our laboratory setup, this worked well. And then we went on and looked which visualization techniques do we actually want to compare. So the first one was clear from the beginning. We wanted to have some kind of baseline rendering method, and this was just one standard form shaded approach. We used Unity 3D to implement all techniques, and this was done by a standard shader method. Next, we used the virtual mirror approach, which was presented by Bichemeyer. And this comes down to positioning a virtual mirror into the augmented world. And on the mirror, every virtual object gets reflected. And using this reflection, we can get a deeper insight on how objects are positioned to one another. An additional technique that we analyzed was presented by Hansen et al. And this comes down to depth encoding silhouettes, which is basically that object silhouettes are rendered and are color encoded to a grayscale. So nearer objects are white, objects that are far away are black. And we especially used this concept in our study because it was presented for a projection setup. Yeah. Different approach works kind of similar, but it uses not grayscale, but the pseudochroma depth color scale, which goes from red to a blue scale, and we put it on the whole surface of these objects. The pseudochroma depth technique was first presented by Rupinski et al., and there are different works where this technique was used on blood vessels, and there were some promising results with that, so we decided to include it in our AR study as well. Last but not least, we used an illustrative technique, which was presented by Lawonn, and this technique combines a couple of things. One is some supporting lines, which go from these objects to a ground plane. This ground plane has some lines that can give a clue about the distance, and there are also some illustrative shadows positioned on that plane. So I have also a video where you can all see or get an imagination on how it all worked. So especially on this monoscopic view, you can see these effects of these kinematic depth cues and how these visualizations worked. And especially for the depth encoding silhouettes and the pseudochroma depth concepts, I'll just play it again. You may have seen some weird color switchings. These were on purpose because these two concepts encode depth to a color scale, and to do so, you have to define a certain direction in which you calculate these distances. And for our case, we decided on supporting two principal directions. One was forwards and one was downwards. And we implemented a switch that the user could control. So when the head position was tilted upwards, then the color encoding was done to the front. And when the users looked down, the color encoded switched to the bottom. So then we set up and planned our study. We had no restrictions regarding the sample design, so we recruited 37 participants, 18 of which were female and 19 male. And they were given the task to sort 5 virtual cubes, which were in forward and downward principal directions, and these cubes were positioned below the table. These were the same setup and cubes as you saw in the video, and we decided to use these abstract cubic models because we wanted to find some rather general results at this point. When I say these cubes were partially randomly arranged below the table, I mean that we defined subcells in the virtual space below the table. So we split this space up and we arranged these cubes in a way that occlusions could be avoided. So we thought about existing depth cues, and we wanted to reduce effects of other depth cues than the presented ones to a minimum. So we wanted to present these cubes in a way that the occlusion depth cue is minimized to a certain extent. This is also why we we slightly changed the rotation and scaling between these cubes. So not all cubes were scaled uniformly, but we had different scalings, so that farther cubes might have been bigger than nearer cubes. So yeah, all in order to neglect the relative size of that cube. We also had these depth lines, which went from the top of the table to the bottom. These were there to clarify the virtual space and to give just some more cues about which is the virtual space in which the cubes are positioned in. So for the study, we had two independent variables, one of which were the actual visualization concepts that we wanted to compare. So this is a 5-factor level. We had 5 factor levels. And we had an additional variable, which was the display mode. So I said we had stereoscopic projectors, and from these projectors we derived 2 display modes and 2 conditions for this variable, which was one of those was a monoscopic visualization mode and one was stereoscopic. Moreover, we measured 5 dependent variables. Those were 2 sorting errors. So participants were given the task to sort these cubes in 2 directions. We regarded these user sortings as one permutation of the correct sorting of these cubes. And from these 2 permutations, we calculated the inversion number and took these as sorting errors in both directions. Also, we measured task completion time, and we measured the overall head movement during each trial, and we measured the subjectively perceived difficulty using a 6-point Likert scale. The procedure was as follows. We artificially dimly lit the room so we could have similar conditions for all trials. Then we had a free training phase where every concept was explained. Users could see how different the monoscopic and stereoscopic display modes were. Users could learn about the head tilting stuff for these 2 concepts that I explained earlier. And then we started the real experiment. And between users, we changed by starting between monoscopic and stereoscopic modes to avoid bias in this matter. And between concepts, we also randomized these. Then we had each user repeat each concept 3 times. So it was 3 times per concept, per monoscopic and per stereoscopic view, so 30 trials overall per user. So from all this data that we acquired, we performed 2 Way Anovas for our 2 variables, for all our variables with these 2 independent variables. And these are the results for the first factor. Each plot that you see has some significant results, statistically significantness resulting from the ANOVAs. For these concept factors, you could clearly see a ranking. So the Falk shaded approach has the biggest sorting error, and the supporting lines have the lowest ones. And when you look at the other plots, a similar ranking is visible as well. There are some differences regarding the mirror concept, for example, in the second plot, which is a little bit above the Falk shading, but you get the general idea that especially the support lines were better in every variable than the rest, and the pseudo-chroma depth rendering approach was a little bit behind, but also better than most of the other concepts. A similar thing gets clear when we're looking at the display mode main effects. So stereoscopic rendering was always better for each variable, which was kind of expected, but we could prove it with this experiment after all. And since we performed 2 Way Anovas, we also had to analyze possible interaction effects, and there we also have significant interaction effects for each variable, which is which we have to explain, and which has to be explained because it could neglect potentially all other results. But in our case, this is not true. So these can be explained best when we're looking at the downward sorting error interaction plot. So this is mostly due to the differences between monoscopic and stereoscopic display modes between each concept. So when we're looking at the Falk, we have a huge difference between monoscopic and stereoscopic, but when we're looking at the support line concepts, the difference between these display modes gets less. So this is basically what probably caused these interaction effects. So to sum up our results, we could show a clear ranking between the evaluated visualization concepts. Form shading rated worst and the supporting lines were best. We could show that stereoscopic mode is better than the monoscopic ones across variables. And our interaction effect can be interpreted in a way that stereoscopy is more effective on weaker visualization concepts. And at the same time, the choice of visualization concept had less effect on for the stereoscopic display mode. So when using stereoscopy, it didn't matter that much which visualization we chose. But yeah, when we had the monoscopic one, it did make a difference. So we are working in the medical domain, as I said earlier, and we did this rather abstract study. So how can we transfer this data to realistic data sets? So we have to think about a couple of things. I said the supporting lines concept rated best, so we have to regard how can we even use these lines in large data sets. So this may be crowded. We have to think about this in future studies. This may be possible to just limit these lines to just certain regions of interest. Then we could use these color coding methods, but then we would occupy the color channel, and we might want to use the color channel in some different way. So what else could we do? We did not include in our study some more advanced shading methods. So there are more possibilities than just form shading. We could use more specular highlights. We could use different shaders. And also there are advanced transparency options, which may be kind of hard since we're using a projecting system which can't really use transparency or which uses transparency by default. But there are some advanced options available in the literature which we have to take a look at. And we could take a look at glyph-based methods, which are kind of similar to the supporting lines. So this also raises the question how we can use it in large data sets. But I think there are some possibilities that we could use these. So these are the things we want to take a deeper look in the future. But as of this work, we can say that visualizations should, to some extent, encode additional depth information for projection-based augmented reality, especially when stereopsis is no available option, which may be the case more often than you would think, especially when we're looking at the medical domain. We can't really say that we have less sterility problems when we're using projectors, but then we have to use these goggles to use the stereoscopy. So then we might rather have just monoscopic views. And this brings us to the point that we need these more depth encoding visualizations. So this I can show you my references, and I thank you for your attention, and I thank my funders. Thank you.
Very interesting study. Questions? So you already addressed the point with if you have too many objects, but you said that color would be a lot. Now the problem is here, for example, vision and copy. Did you include some of them in the discussion? Does it make an effect?
I'm not really sure. I think we did check for color vision impairments, but we only had like 1 or 2 participants, so it didn't make any difference of that. So this is also why we used the pseudo-chroma depth technique, which has blue and red shades, which is better than red and green, which is the most common color vision impairment. So what I'm thinking about is concentrating rather on this depth encoded silhouettes concept, but not use the grayscale, but use rather this red and blue color scale instead. So this is an option I'm thinking about. Good. So this would basically enable the color channel for other stuff, so do some risk maps or something like that, and at the same time have the silhouettes to encode the distance information. So this would be an example.
I was thinking that something bugged me a little bit, which is that there's a difference maybe between a queue and providing information. And it seems that the supporting line is just providing that information. And that leads to the question, why don't you just provide the information? Why don't you label the objects with the depth, which may be what you mean by saying you use different basic methods. And then that leads to the next question, which is, why don't you just do that? But maybe it takes more cognitive effort to read the labels and then do the sorting based on the actual information. I was wondering if you had some thoughts about the motivation for using cues rather than labels. Is that because you want people to sort of intuitively get it?
Yeah, right. We want to make it rather intuitively, intuitively. So the faster you can get these informations, the better. And if you put labels, I think in this experiment, if we just use these 5 cubes and put 5 distance labels on them, this would have been the best, I think. But in more realistic data sets, I think the labels weren't the best option.
Well, then that may be a good experiment to be to sort of measure the cognitive effects of
right. Thinking about that in the future.
Doing these kinds of experiences whether there's a person with glasses, sometimes it's a little bit hard to see that. Any of the people who were participating in your experiment were glasses?
They were, but none of them reported any difficulties. So what was not really visible in the video is that the monoscopic view is definitely way more harder to see than the stereoscopic one. The stereoscopic one is like, you see it right away. You see that these are 3-dimensional cubes. You see where they are. When you don't have the stereopsis, you have to get used to it. And yeah, this is the problem that we experienced after all, but this was not related to users wearing glasses. Yeah, probably. This comes also down to these cubes that we were just using. We could have used these instead, which would have probably made a difference. We had one light source positioned just above the table. We did this to mimic somehow, we thought about where the projectors were, and then we said like, okay, these projectors are above, so we put a light source above, which may not have been optimal, especially for these cubes with all these strip shapes. So.
You mentioned that one of the limitations of moving from the simple cube example to more real data that you're visualizing is the density of the data, or how large it is. But it also strikes me that one of the issues with those supporting lines is you need a ground plane that they can project down to. And it seems like in the medical domain that you frequently wouldn't have that. I'm kind of picturing a case displaying data on a patient or something. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, we have thought about that as well. We would need to take a deeper look into that. One of my first approaches was that I thought about not projecting these depth lines or these supporting lines to the bottom, but instead to the projection surface, so to the top. So in our patient case, that would mean that we have the liver, for example, and then there are some lines going to the skin, to the patient. So this is something we could think about. Yeah, other stuff we would have to take a deeper look into.
Last question.
So you may have said this, but what is the range of depth you tested, first of all? And then secondly, the depth cues may be a variable function of the distance. For instance, the binocular disparity for the stereoscopic view will be getting less and less as you go further and further out. Whereas the grayscale, you may set it as a linear function of the depth. So depending on the depth, maybe the importance of the depth cues may change. So have you considered these factors?
We have only considered it in that way that we limited the user position to the front of the table, and we were thinking ahead of our future use case, and this would include a standing position in front of a table like that as well, and a similar distance to what we used. So we used this. It was probably the eventual use case in the future. So we were thinking about this, and we only limited in the way that we did not change the standing positions of users. So they had this limited space in which they could move. So it was just at the front of the table. But they had to stay within these standing positions. They couldn't get way more behind, or they couldn't really move. So.
Okay, let's thank Florian, Heinrich from the University of